Here, also where I am. I'm in São Paulo, Brazil. I am a lawyer and researcher in international environmental law, and my research mainly focuses on youth action against climate change. So, how can international law, and particularly human rights and environmental law, be mobilized to protect youth and future generations from the harmful effects of climate change? So, that's how I got into all of this. I'm just about finishing my master's, which I hope will be published soon, and where I look particularly to the Inter-American system of human rights.
Amazing. Thank you for this wonderful introduction. And I actually, just a few days ago, I was in Uruguay, Montevideo, like in your part of the world. And now I quickly moved to United Kingdom where I have some meetings to do. So São Paulo is a beautiful city. I had a layover over there. And
Oh, great.
now I have Eliane on my screen. So could you also briefly introduce yourselves?
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm Elian. I am a research associate at C4UN, Coalition for the UN We Need, and my main work with C4UN focuses on the Pact for the Future, Chapter 4 specifically, and the Declaration on Future Generations. So that's one of the many things I do. I wear so many other hats, but all of them are related and linked in a way or another to youth engagement and youth participation in decision making and policy making processes. Thank you.
Wonderful. I know that you've engaged in the negotiations on the Pact for the Future and Declaration on Future Generations. So we would be keen on learning how like those whole negotiations went through. Next on my screen is Elena. The floor is yours.
Hey everyone, and thanks Olga for the invitation. I'm super excited to be here. I am the Climate Youth Delegate for Switzerland to COP30, and I'm currently based in Brussels. I got into the youth space in the UNFCCC, where we are part of the youth constituency Jungo, where we were basically, fighting to get children and youth in as consideration in the decision texts for climate conferences. But last year, I've met Jen and Olga as well, and we thought it would be nice to start a research project on how young people perceive intergenerational equity, because when we were advocating on the ground, we realized that the concept has been named many times, but we haven't really understood how it was implemented and understood from young people. So we started the research project earlier this year, and I'm really happy to present more about it later.
Thank you, Elena, for this brief introduction. And once again, congratulations on representing the government of Switzerland at upcoming COP. So my applause to you. And I have Daria next on my screen.
Hello, everyone. My name is Daria. I'm joining from sunny Geneva, actually. I have a lot of hats. The one you presented me with, Olga. So I'm a project lead for UNU's University Center for Policy Research, where I support the implementation of the UN Declaration on Future Generations. Initially, I'm a foresight practitioner, and I've come to the conclusion that foresight cannot be done effectively without being embedded in this very strong principle of intergenerational equity. This is why I've embarked on the journey of the Summit of the Future through multiple initiatives. For example, I have started with a group of friends an NGO that is called Foresight for Intergenerational Decision Making. Sorry, Intergenerational Center for Global Action. The first name was the name of the initiative. Then I am leading with the School of International Futures, the Intergenerational Fairness Hub, where we have a lot of meaningful discussions of what does intergenerational equity mean within our communities, and very much looking forward for this discussion.
Thank you for joining us, and I'm excited to hear like all these different perspectives on intergenerational equity and linking this to foresight because unfortunately this is like an emerging field and we are building the space for learning more. And as Elena have mentioned, we have launched our own project on youth foresight and learning more on how young people perceive and understand intergenerational equity through their youth lenses. So now I will give the floor to Lena to introduce the project and tell us more, especially because we have just finished our first global survey and we are ready to share some of the preliminary results. So, Elena, the floor is yours, and I will share the screen so that you can proceed with the presentation.
Thank you, Olga. And let me wait for the first slide to appear.
Or you can start. I'll need to manage all my tabs first.
All right. Okay, then let me start with how we've started.
Oops.
And we have started by realizing that there's a gap in the international governmental policymaking space where international equity is widely acknowledged, but there is lack of real-world implementation and measurement of progress. And it's a youth-led and collaborative research project, and we have a core group of 3 people, which is Gennaro, Olga, and me, and then we have about 15 volunteers who help us with the different phases of the research. And on the next slide, you can see the context, why we think that youth-informed strategic foresight is necessary, and Tauja already had a really great perspective on this. And we also think it's important because the triple planetary crisis is a global and intergenerational issue in itself, and that the governments are failing to implement it meaningfully as a legal principle. And then finally, I mean, young people are at the conferences, we are raising our voices more and more, but when it comes to actual decision making and drafting of text that is then adopted by governments, we're often sidelined, although we will be more affected by decisions taken and also by the crises that worsen over time. And not only us as young people, but also future generations. And this is why we have set ourselves 3 objectives: to understand how young people perceive intergenerational equity in the context of the crises and sustainable development, and then also to create future scenarios of what a world would look like when intergenerational equity is, as a principle, is upheld, or if not. And then have different pathways of how to get to these future scenarios. And then finally, we would like to measure the progress to uphold intergenerational equity to like the best version of the future. And this would be through youth responsive indicators. And next, we can also see that we have developed our phases based on these objectives. We first have a global survey that we have conducted from April to June this year. We have closed the survey early June, and as you can imagine, we're still analyzing the data, but sharing some preliminary results, especially from the quantitative data today. And then we will hold foresight workshops where we are doing like focus group sessions to assess some of the signals of change and do more horizon scanning of what signals of change young people see regarding intergenerational equity in the future, which we will also apply foresight methodologies, which is still in development. And finally, as mentioned before, we want to create an assessment framework. More about this comes later in the project, but first I'm happy to share some results. So our main questions were for the survey: how do young people across different regions understand and experience the principle, and what signals, trends, and future visions shape the path forward? And we will jump right into the results. And maybe first about the survey. We had 27 questions across 4 sections. We asked the people about themselves to make sure also that they are under 35 years old and that they are engaged, or we wanted to know whether they are already engaged as young people in any decision-making spaces, which might imply that they have some understanding of the terms. And then the second section was about understanding intergenerational equity, where we also want to have a working definition coming out of it. And then we focused at this section on foresight and signals of change, and finally asked how young people feel and what emotions they have towards the concept. We had a total of 1,118 respondents, of which 437 answered all the questions. You can imagine 27 questions, some dropped out earlier, but still we could get meaningful results from it, also especially from the first sections. And all the people were aged between 18 and 35 years old. If we look at the next slide, you can see that we had 140 countries or people from those countries participating. And in darker colors, we have a bit of, let's say, overrepresentation. And in light colors or in white, we see those countries who have not been, participating. And we can see that India, Nigeria, also the US and the UK, China, we had quite some results. And we can also see that it's 140 countries, quite diverse, and we are happy to also then look at how different regions maybe understand the concept differently, but this will be for later. We've started with realizing, or when we put this question into the survey, we realized that intergenerational equity is not the only term that is currently being used by different spaces. Some use present and future generations, other intergenerational justice, solidarity, fairness. So we would like to understand how young people, which ones are they most familiar with. And we see they could choose multiple answers, and we asked which of them they have heard before. And this shows that present and future generations was the most familiar concept, but then also the others were all mentioned. So we can draw different conclusions from this, but the first one seems to be most accessible. On the next slide, we also wanted to understand which policy domains young people think are most relevant to ensure intergenerational equity. And we thought it would be great to take the SDGs as an indication, and we listed all the SDGs so they could choose multiple where they think the principle is relevant. It's very clear science signals that most of them said climate action and quality education. And it's also important to note that all of the SDGs were mentioned. And I guess that also goes back to the foundations of the SDGs, which in its definition says it should uphold sustainable development to ensure a planet for future generations. So for us, it makes sense that it's across all DGs, the concept is relevant, and for some more than others. If we go to the next slide, we can also see we asked who they think have the biggest responsibility to ensure the principle, and the majority of respondents assigned the responsibility to national governments or intergovernmental organizations. Some said the private sector and citizens, and less prominent were regional groups or civil society organizations. And this also goes in line with the next, where we can see where we asked about which of the institutions or actors have the most power to actually influence the decisions on the term. And there we can see that if people think those who have the biggest responsibilities, like national governments, they are also those in power to influence decisions. So there's a very clear sign towards who young people think are the most important actors to implement it or to uphold the principles. And if we go to the next slide, we asked about the biggest obstacles for intergenerational equity to be upheld, and we listed the tensions that we have identified also from other surveys that have been done. So we got inspired, and also from the literature, where the biggest tensions currently are to uphold. And you can see there's always like one against another, and it became clear from the data that balancing economic growth with long-term sustainability and social justice are seen as key obstacles of intergenerational equity. And when looking back at the SDGs, for example, it was interesting to see that when it comes to economic growth, a policy area that is relevant is the production and consumption patterns. So we will try to draw more insights from that and also see how the different answers correlate. And yeah, there's other interesting ones, but maybe let's go on to this one. Also in the next section where we talked about foresight and signals of change, we have mostly qualitative data on this, so the results will be out later, but first indications are on whether the people have noticed any signals that could influence intergenerational equity in the future. And there was a clear yes from those 450 respondents still in the call or in the survey, let's say, that they said yes, there is signals, and these are not only positive but also negative, mostly negative if we compare the first two answers. And what those are will be analyzed later. And to end on a bit of a positive note, we have asked the people which of those emotions or feelings were evoked when they think about intergenerational equity. And the majority had selected positive emotions of hope, of determination and empowerment, with also not to underlook the anxiety that it can induce, but also fear, anger, and sadness. I guess this shows that it's a meaningful tool, intergenerational equity, to also motivate young people to act. And yeah, ending on the preliminary results, the question is what's next? And we will finalize first the qualitative data analysis, including the working definition and analyzing the signals of change. We will produce a report and a policy briefs with the results, hopefully as soon as possible. But yeah, let's say August probably published. And then we will have our first Foresight workshop at the Financing for Development conference coming up in Sevilla in next week, where Gennaro will host a one-day event where we will also have the chance to have workshop on foresight, but in a very specific context of the outcomes of the Financing for Development. So if you're there, I will share the link in the chat, and there might be also options to participate online in the event, so I can share the links later. So it would be, you're invited to join. And here, I think the QR code works, but please let me know if not, and I will share the link to the project where you can get updates. And if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out and stay in touch. I hope I was on time, Olga. Back to you.
Yes, you are on time. Thank you for this wonderful scene setting. I'm always fascinated when I look into these results and kind of try to analyze or reflect on some of the responses. And I think one of their most fascinating questions for me is the feelings that intergenerational equity invokes from young people. And it's fascinating to see that it's hope, determination, and empowerment. So, on this note, I would like to start our discussion and ask our panelists to share their thoughts on the survey and on the data presented by Elena. I do not necessarily want to call on you, so feel free to unmute yourself and share your perspectives. Whoever wants to come first.
Okay, I'll go first. We kind of conducted a similar, not with the same questions, but kind of a similar survey with young people about their feeling of agency in times of crisis to actually conduct such exercises with their decision-making bodies. What strikes me was straight after the COVID crisis was 2021, 2022. And I think what strikes me is that the feeling of powerlessness was prevalent, but the feeling of they thought themselves as agents of change. It was not all doom and gloom. It was yes, the landscape is really dark, and I cannot see anything um, hopeful for myself innovation where I can have agency. And what strikes me is that we have actually a much hopeful landscape even with your survey. Um, so I'm hoping that during our discussion we'll be able to tackle, this issue of um, not only youth empowerment, but youth as being agents of change, and not only their feeling of power, but the ability of institutions to absorb all of these energy and insights.
Thank you, Daria, for bringing this youth as agents of change, because we often also hear youth as agents of tomorrow, and we need to switch that narrative that youth are present here already, and we are doing so much in decision-making spaces, and youth are agents of today. And with this note, Elaine or Laura, would you like to share your reflections?
Sure. To grab on what you said, Olga, I think this is such an important point to highlight that youth are already here today and are already suffering the consequences of current inaction and of past inaction. So I think it's very hopeful to see that there are positive feelings surrounding, and I am actually surprised to see that it was the majority of feelings in the sense were positive ones. And I think this shares a good note that there is a perspective for actual engagement and for change. So even though we have that the principle of intergenerational equity is very vague and efforts are very abstract in the sense, youth has been mobilizing and is mobilizing and is using this principle and other principles in soft law and human rights all as tools to ensure that their present and their future is protected. I think it was very positive to see that there are good feelings coming out of this.
Thank you, Laura. Eliane, would you like to?
Yes, sure. Thank you first, Elena, for the presentation, and congratulations on the work done. I mainly share the same feeling. I mean, I'm not surprised to see the positive feeling because I'm happy to see it, but I'm not surprised to see it because I mean, we're all encountered by young people every day, and we work with young people each from a different angle. And yes, I do hear some who are, let's say, losing some sort of the direction or hope or whatever that is. But these are the few, they are not the majority, but the majority is still, regardless whether they are, yes, they are acknowledging the challenges that we are all going through because they are hard not to acknowledge. But at the same time, they do know that we all have it all. They have it all as young people. We have it all as young people. And I guess that the more challenges we face, the more they feel motivated to do better and to do more. So I think this survey, such platforms are very important and crucial to hear from young people and shape tomorrow's strategies based on their reflections. Yeah.
I like your perspective when you say that the more challenges we have, the more motivated we feel to kind of address those challenges, especially because of the intergenerational multiplier effect that the Pact for the Future kind of recognizes. And I think now it would be important to kind of transition into understanding what intergenerational equity is. And Laura, I will give the floor to you because you have studied the principle during your master's, and we would like to hear more from you. How would you define intergenerational equity from a legal perspective? And what are the primary challenges in defining its core elements, and especially in these decision-making spaces?
Of course. Thank you, Olga. So I think just to take a step back, I see that we have people from very diverse backgrounds. Intergenerational equity is a principle, and for the law, a principle is sort of a fundamental guideline to the interpretation, application, and creation of legal norms, whether those are domestic, whether it's international norms, treaties. So they affect not only how these treaties are to be made, but how they are to be interpreted and applied. So principles are generally very abstract and very vague. This isn't a specific character of intergenerational equity. It's principles as a whole. They have this vague nature and abstract nature. So the idea is that they are used to enforce and interpret legislation. And in environmental law, this is very relevant because there is a prevalence or soft law that is all these declarations and principles. They have an important role to play more so than in other areas of international law. So intergenerational equity is a principle, and it's a principle of international environmental law that imposes a duty on present generations to manage and preserve environmental resources in a manner that doesn't compromise the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So it stems from an ethical commitment of fairness between generations and reflects the understanding that environmental degradation and harm that happens today will have repercussions in the future and for the future. And we, as you've mentioned, we don't have many elements or many decisions of a binding nature that can elucidate what comprises intergenerational equity. So we have to turn to legal scholars and to doctrine. And one example is Edith Brown Weiss. I can share her name and her article later in the chat if that's helpful. She talks on three key duties linked to conservation when we think about intergenerational equity. So we have the conservation of options, that is preserving natural resources and biodiversity for future generations, the conservation of the quality of these resources, so maintaining environmental quality and environmental well-being, and the conservation of access to these resources. So this is the overall concept, but it's important for us to notice that, albeit it's vague and abstract, it's also very much in line with other principles in international environmental law. For instance, sustainable development also holds the idea that we need to address the interests of present generations without compromising future generations, without compromising the environment. So what some scholars say is that not only can intergenerational equity be seen as an autonomous principle on its own, it could also be seen as the quote unquote temporal dimension of sustainable development. So, how we would categorize it differs if we think of it as a principle, a standalone principle, and if we think of it as part of sustainable development. But truth of the matter is however we fit it, if we fit it on its own or as a part of sustainable development, it's still quite abstract and still lacking of means for enforcement and implementation. And when we think of, well, what can be challenging when defining its core elements, this vague character is a potential obstacle, but as I've said, this is quite normal for principles and for soft law as a whole. What is, I think, the main issue with intergenerational equity is that we are not clear on who this principle is aimed at protecting. We say, oh, the future and future generations, but we are not clear on who future generations are. And I think Eliane could later speak to that. We have some relevant advances with the Pact for the Future and the Annex Declaration. But since until quite recently, we didn't have a consensus on who this principle aims to protect and who future generations are, it becomes tricky when we try to apply, because how do we apply something if we don't know who is going to benefit, who is applying? So for instance, when we seek intergenerational equity, we could use it to protect unborn generations, so future generations in the broadest sense, to protect young people, youth, age up to 35, as we saw in the survey, or children as a more specific group of young people. And if we try to do that, this will have different ramifications for each of these groups. For instance, children have a specific legal regime that protects their rights and their needs. Young people don't have a specific legal regime, but we can turn to human rights and future generations, and that's where it gets very tricky. There isn't anything at all. You could argue human rights because there isn't a temporal limitation to human rights, but the the biggest challenge, in my view, is who this principle is aiming to protect. And this will be mitigated and has already been mitigated with the Maastricht principles in human rights and in the Pact for the Future, but it still needs to be more studied and more detailed on how we can distinguish these groups and what specific protection can be afforded to each of them.
Thank you, Laura, for this great overview of the legal scene on intergenerational equity. And yes, I do agree that up until recently, we didn't have clear mechanisms of enforcement and implementation. But last year, in September 2024, all member states adopted Pact for the Future. And it annexed it also the Declaration on Future Generations. And my next question, next logical question would be to Eliane to share her perspectives on Pact for the Future because you were there in the rooms and saw, like in reality, how it was adopted. So the floor is yours, and please let us know what should we expect in terms of the implementation of intergenerational equity in the near future.
Yes, sure. Thank you so much. I just want to quickly reflect on a few things that Laura shared, answering your question at the same time. So, as you already mentioned, the Pact for the Future was adopted in September 2024 after almost 18 months of negotiation, leading to the adoption in 2024, and where we have the Chapter 4, which is on youth and future generations, and the Annex Declaration on future generations. Now, what is important here is that the Declaration on Future Generations clearly identified future generations as those who are not born yet, and it clearly says do not exist yet, but they will inherit the planet. And that was after a long negotiation on who they are. And then they reached this point of future generations are those who do not exist. And of course, youth are the young people who exist. And there is this like the common point between the two is the multiplier effect, which was mentioned in one of the articles I co-wrote with Nodara Youssef. And the point is that whether they exist or they don't exist yet, whether they are young people existing now or future generations who will exist in the future, in both cases, there is this multiplier effect, which means, going back to what Lara was saying, that every action or inaction we take today has an impact on the young generation and has an impact on those who are not born yet. And while there is no maybe legal framework to talk about those who do not exist, but there is this moral responsibility we have as human beings, because those who are not born yet actually do not have anyone else other than us to protect them when they are born, because they have no say. They're not here. They have us. They have those who are still here or those who are here to make sure that whatever they inherit from us is actually a planet they can live, a planet they can live on. So that's mainly my reflection on what Laura said, but also answering your question. But I want to add also a few things that this was actually the first time the Declaration on Future Generations itself was actually what is considered, should be considered a milestone in global governance, because this is the first time that we see that the international community is actually agreeing on who future generations are and what are our obligations toward them. So yes, the Sustainable Development Goal and the framework from 1987, the Brundtland Report, they do acknowledge the future generations in maybe in broader sense, or the young people, but the Declaration on Future Generations put some sort of more framework. Yes, a clear framework, a clear ethical framework for who this generation is, what are the guiding principles, what are the commitments, and what are the actions, so we can make sure to safeguard their future. And I want to also mention something that is also important, that in the, like, there are so many things in the inside the document, and I can also put it in the chat for those who would like to read it. But the Declaration on Future Generations, one of the things that is very important, that is mentioned in there, is that the possibility of appointing a UN Special Envoy for future generations. And hosting a high-level review at the 83rd UN General Assembly for the declaration. And I can say that throughout the negotiations, the 18-month negotiation before we reached the adoption of the pact and the declaration, the idea of the UN Special Envoy was very important for those who were very involved in the entire process. And somehow it was a win to see it happening and see it written in the document. So I can say in short that the entire process, the adoption of the pact not followed, but the adoption of the pact, which was also an adoption of the Declaration of Future Generations, somehow is a step from rhetorical commitment to more of a structured accountability for future impact. I'll pause here. Maybe I'll save some for later.
Thank you, Eliane. And kind of following on you mentioning different steps, actionable steps on implementing Declaration of Future Generations, we do have like this idea of appointing N1 future generations, and there is like an entire list of actionable steps. And I want to pose a next question to Daria, because you are following the implementation of this declaration. So what can we expect in the next few years? And what signals of change do you already notice that kind of indicate that we are on the way to operationalize this principle?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Olga, and thank you to all the speakers, the previous speakers who really set the ground for what is intergenerational equity, who are future generations, and what are our duties to them, which I think are big questions that actually date back to the 70s, have been answered to several times. But I think the Pact for the Future finally, and the Declaration of Future Generations finally bring an end to all these endless debates. Future generations are those generations unborn who will inherit our planet. Going back to Eliane's point, they do not have power to vote. They do not have financial power. Yet our decisions are taking a huge amount are putting a huge amount of burden on them and are discounting from their possibilities. Since the adoption of the Declaration on Future Generations, the debates during the summit were hard, but I think the principle was agreed upon by member states. They just didn't know how to take it forward in practice, which is the very topic of our debate today. In practice, since the summit, there has been a lot of pockets of innovation bubbling up, and I think what it brought to the world is momentum. These innovators, these pioneers who already knew kind of where to go and what to put in practice finally had a resource, an international framework, and multilateral principles backing their activities, which helped them really strengthen their national coalitions. Just to give you an example, the EU for a long time had discussed to have a representative for future generations. In June 2024, straight before the Summit of the Future, Ursula von der Leyen announced that she would be appointing an intergenerational fairness commissioner, which was very new, answering to this question of protecting future generations within the EU. After the Summit of the Future, the debates were so interesting and brought so many new ways of working forward that this strategy is being shaped right now by European citizens and by young people at the EU level. The commissioner appointed in November 2024 this year has said we'll do an original thing, which is asking for citizens committed to design this intergenerational fairness strategy. So this is one pocket of innovation. Another one in Denmark. In Denmark, after the Summit of the Future, an alliance of organizations have created an impact coalition on future generations, aiming to appoint a commissioner for future generations there, once again within government, holding into account decision makers on the budget they are spending and how it discounts from the possibilities of future generations to spend it on other important matters. And we are seeing, as of today, the rise of military expenditures that is distracting from necessary investments in climate mitigation and adaptation. So this is one way to hold into account a government. Let's go to another continent now, Kenya. Kenya, straight after the Summit of the Future, has launched a caucus within their Senate to implement this declaration on future generations. Very interesting kind of legislative work being taken forward by the Senate to implement anticipatory governance, have a more participatory way of working. And finally, another example, let's go to another continent. Let's go to Latin America. Chile hosted the third World Summit of Parliamentary Committees of the Future, which every year brings in, these innovators, these pioneers that are trying to legislate for the future. And this year they have adopted within and committed to this declaration on future generations and to all the action points. So this declaration on future generations is not simple words. It's not simple principles. It's principles that have been hardly fought for, and they inspire actions and give power for action within a lot of countries, regions. And let's take now just a final example on the legal level. In 2023, the ICJ, the UN adopted a resolution pushed by students from the Pacific Islands to have an advisory opinion on states' obligation on climate change, asking basically the question, what is states' obligation to future generations? And in December 2024, the ICJ hosted the biggest public hearing on an advisory opinion. It was the most attended in the history of the ICJ, specifically on the duties that will clarify the duties for future generations. So while this ICJ advisory opinion is underway, it's still in decision mode. I think that what the Summit of the Future and the Declaration on Future Generations have provided is momentum, clarity, and hope for all of these pioneers that are working day to day on this topic.
Thank you, Daria. And kind of adding up on what Declaration on Future Generation set up, I think it also inspired us, inspired our curiosity to build on this principle of intergenerational equity and innovate the ways of how we as young people can also contribute to its practical implications. And thank you so much for bringing this example of the advisory opinion and ICJ. And it's kind of a perfect follow-up question for Laura because she works in climate litigation cases and she works with young people. So from your practical experience, can you tell us more of how young people bring this principle of intergenerational equity forward?
Of course, thank you for your question. It was wonderful to hear examples, Dayoya. I wasn't familiar with lots of them. That's very good to know. And I think it's a good segue because when we think of how youth uses intergenerational equity, it's mainly through activism, whether that is to push governments and to push representatives to adopting legislation, to changing their policies. But in my point of view and what I focus my studies on is youth climate litigation. So taking to the judiciary to try to seek accountability for states and governments and corporations that fail to prevent foreseeable climate harms. So what happens is that since intergenerational equity is present in environmental law, international environmental law as a whole, it's also very present even if we look at broad commitments in national documents and national targets and national laws. For instance, in Brazil, our constitution says that the environment is a right for present and future generations. It then doesn't go on to explain how the future generations would go about exercising this right, but it's a right that has to be protected for present and future generations. So what happens is that you take these sort of more generic provisions that embed intergenerational equity in domestic law and you put them together with other laws, so other constitutional rights, other human rights. And what happens mainly is that intergenerational equity is grouped with human rights that such as the right to life, the right to health, the right to a healthy environment. And then this is all mobilized together because while we don't have a specific mechanism for intergenerational equity, there are mechanisms at the domestic or even at the international level to seek the reparation of human rights. So this is what tends to happen. You rely on intergenerational equity as a narrative, as an argument, but the tool that you're using is human rights or constitutional rights. And what happens in these cases is youth seeks and uses intergenerational equity for its own benefit and for the benefit of those not yet born. We've also had a case in Brazil where the case was ultimately settled, so there wasn't any decision because we've had a change in government, but where a group of youth challenged the update of the Brazilian NDC because back in 2020 there was an update of the NDC and Brazil filed an update that was less ambitious than their previous target. So six youths that are engaged in other activism initiatives such as Fridays for the Future and Engajamundo, which we have here in Brazil, they entered with this lawsuit and challenging this update. And one of their arguments said that not only did they have a right to challenge this on their own behalf, but they had a duty as proxies of future generations to challenge this on behalf of future generations. So, what happens a lot is that we do see youth position themselves as proxies for future generations, which could be seen on a glass half full and a glass half empty kind of note. It depends on the perspective, but truth of the matter is that due to the abstract nature of intergenerational equity, it's used more as a narrative tool, and the legal mechanisms that are available are often reliant on other fields such as human rights and environmental law in and of itself. But what is very hopeful is that these cases are becoming more and more frequent and not just in developed countries, but in developing countries as well. And this reflects youth engagement and youth activism and also gives a hopeful note because when we think of litigation, of course, it isn't a very simple process and it isn't a very effective process. It can be time consuming, it can consume a lot of resources, but there are significant procedural tools and various NGOs and groups that are aiding children and youth groups in this. So I think overall it's we have a positive outcome or a positive overview, even if it is a very difficult process.
Thank you, Laura, for sharing these perspectives. And I didn't know about like these cases that have happened in Brazil. And it's especially interesting to see like these developments because Brazil is hosting COP30. So let's see how this will develop further. And kind of continuing these practical examples of youth leadership and youth agency. Elian, Elian, my question to you would be, what is the role of young people in kind of pushing intergenerational equity further? and like especially bridging this gap of intergenerational equity, social and environmental justice, and also human rights-based approaches.
Yes, thank you so much. So, I guess we reached the point. I mean, we're still talking about youth engagement and the intergenerational equity, and we will keep talking about it. But I guess, in my own opinion, maybe I'm a little bit subjective, but bear with me. In my own opinion, that we're doing better in this area than I don't know, we were doing 4 or 5 years ago. And what I'm trying to say here is that I've seen so many examples where young people are way more welcome in the room and the discussions and the conversations, way more than it was before, as they should. It's not like welcomed as if someone is giving them a favor. I'm just saying that we used to fight a lot to have one seat for one young person on a panel, in a conversation, in a decision making process. Now it's becoming, I can say, easier, but because only young people were able to prove that the seat is theirs, not because anyone is giving anyone a favor. So I guess I wanted to start with on a hopeful note, that we're doing better in this area than we were doing before. And then this takes me to the next point I want to say, is that in all cases, this equity and the involvement of the young generation with the senior generation, it's not a matter of, it's not about only a matter of fairness. It's also in a pragmatic way that this is the only way we can we can move forward with sustainability. We can save the planet from all the crises that the planet is going through, because young people have already shown and proved so many times that they are ready, they have the ideas, they have the capacity, they have the motivation, that there's no reason for them not to be involved. So it's not a matter of fairness, it's a matter, yes, it is a matter of fairness at some point, but it's also a matter of, if you want to move forward with the agenda, for climate action, for social justice, you need young people. And again, so many people acknowledge this this already. And then the third thing I want to say is that you cannot you cannot say that you're moving forward with the sustainability agenda. You cannot say that you're committed to it. You can't do that while on the other hand acting in a different way. So what I'm trying to say here is that if you're committed to that agenda, then you will involve young people, then you will consider their present, then you will involve, and you will also consider future generations and the actions you take today. And if you don't, then your actions or inactions will impact them. So it's either this or that. You cannot care about the sustainable development agenda and leave young people behind, or you cannot care about that agenda and not consider the future generations, because they cannot come, they cannot happen at the same time. So it's either you're this or you are that. So I don't know if, like, maybe I'll just add one thing, that we can do a lot of research, and we can do a lot of get so much evidence on how can we move with this agenda forward, and how can we involve more young people, and how can we achieve this intergenerational equity. But there is also always the importance of like, how do we turn that into real action on the grounds, allowing young people not to be those who are next in line to lead actions, but actually being the transitive agents of today. And this is actually was what was explicitly laid out in the Pact for the Future, Chapter 4, Youth and Future Generations, from Actions 34 to 37, and focus on health and education and youth participation, and fund, and so many other aspects that young people need to be able to participate in a meaningful way in multilateral spaces. So yeah, that's it. I'll stop here.
Thank you for kind of explaining us what could be the actionable steps on bringing intergenerational equity and youth engagement into kind of reality on the ground. And now I want to pose the question to Daria. Okay, we've kind of covered present actions. What about future actions? And you are a practitioner in foresight. So, what is the role of futures thinking in advancing intergenerational equity?
Okay, going back to what Laura said actually on the intergenerational equity being the narrative tool and the human rights, being the narrative and human rights and constitutional rights being the tool, for example. I would say that it, in a more general way, and in actually a very short way, foresight is, sorry, intergenerational equity is the hardware. If we want to take an analogy, it represents the structural foundation, or if you want, the end goal that our systems should be built upon. It defines the what a system is designed, which is a system that is ensuring fairness across generations. Foresight or legal or constitutional rights would be the software there, if we draw on the analogy. These are the tools, the capabilities that will enable decision makers to operate in the system effectively. It's really the how. Taking on the example of scenario planning, for example, a lot of countries and member states are actually accelerating their use of strategic foresight and futures thinking to improve their capacity to absorb shocks, so building resilience, but also to try and make sense of the multiple crises that they are living in. And actually, I have a question to myself that I've been asking myself for a long time. I had a very amazing discussion with my colleague from OECD, Josh Polshar, about it, which is, can we do futures thinking in times of crisis, where there is downward pressure on funding, where there is a short-term bias and an urgency to answer to questions? Well, after this debate, we just joke that once you know what the future is, it's already too late. Foresight is not about predicting it. It's about looking at the different possibilities, making sense of the different possibilities of the future unfolding, and acting upon it in advance. So preventive strategies, for example, in humanitarian sector, are proven very effective. The UN Disaster Risk Reduction Platform concluded that for every dollar spent, it's $15 in the future saved. So foresight is part of this ensemble of tools that are the softwares to achieve the hardwares, the bigger picture, intergenerational equity. A lot of organizations within the UN and beyond, like Teach the Future, UNICEF, School of International Futures, are supporting actually the development of youth foresight. So with the particularity of younger generations having not being necessarily in position of power, but being agents of change. I would end by saying that the foresight tools such as and youth engagements are essential to achieve intergenerational equity. However, they are not the only tools. They are necessary. They're a condition. There should be a condition as of today. We're in 2025 and all still advocating for youth engagement, but they're not the only ones. So it's for the example of foresight, you can extend it to legal rights, using constitutional rights, using institutional representation of future generations. There are other tools. And as for youth as agents of change, youth are not the only agents of change. And actually, youth, I'm young, I'm 26. We should not bear the burden of what precedent generations have written for us as a future. We are not the only ones to create fairer systems for tomorrow. We shouldn't be, at least. And the burden of this change shouldn't be only relying on our shoulders. So youth engagement, youth participation is mandatory. It's necessary, and in 2025 we shouldn't be discussing still about this. Unfortunately, we are, but we should be very careful as well that we are not the only voices standing in front of our future and being the ones bearing the responsibility for past failures.
Thank you so much for reiterating that. Yes, youth are agents of change. Yes, youth are the closest to future generations, but we are not the only ones who bear this sense of responsibility because we live with other generation. Like we are the present generation, all of us, different ages, different sectors, different disciplines. We all need to work together to kind of reflect on what our possible future trajectories. And I think to kind of wrap up our discussion, I'll pose my last question to Elena. You have been listening actively to all other speakers. So would you have like any final thoughts and kind of reflect on any concrete actionable steps that can help us embed intergenerational equity into decision making, or what we as young people can do to bring that future forward?
Yes, thank you everyone for these insightful conversations. And Olga, it was such a nice flow between getting a definition and having like an understanding of the Declaration on Future Generations, and then also very actionable, innovative pockets. I think you named them, and or innovation pockets. And for our research, all of those are relevant. So it was great to get an overview. And I think what I learn or take away is that it's less about defining what intergenerational equity is, and it's less about, defining whether or not we want to protect current or future generations, because of course we want to protect all of them as in our research, like in the young people we ask. But it's more about identifying those signals of change and like looking at what's already out there, build on the Declaration of Future Generations, and maybe also, yeah, make use of the mappings that are already there for the pockets of innovation. And for instance, we had the great opportunity to also be part of this strategy process from the European Commission, which has given us like great access to see inside of one of those innovations. And what struck me from this example or from this experience was that it's built across all policy areas of the EU. And another concern I had is that if the EU spends so much time and resources now on developing the terms, developing the logic of intergenerational equity with so much resources and capacity and participation, how do we make sure that all global voices are being represented then? If my concern as a European is it then overly dominating the space? And I think it just sheds light on also looking at global understandings and also bringing that forward in the EU's process. So I think that's one reflection I also got from the conversation. And then also for me personally, the legal principles help so much. So Laura, thank you for that work. And I think I will get back to you on more legal terms and how it's tied to human rights and learn from that perspective. So yeah, I'm very hopeful for the next step in our research because we have so many bright minds on these topics in the space. So thank you all for sharing and being so, yeah, available to everyone here.
Thank you, Elena, for wrapping up our conversation. And I see a couple of questions in the chat. Unfortunately, we do not have time to address all of them, but I actually really want to pose a question by Hanuru Fukuda about uh, how we should increase the use of the phrase intergenerational equity. Because as our survey has indicated, there are different understandings of the term. It can be present and future generations, intergenerational equity, fairness, justice, solidarity, and you name it. So, how do we need to strategize to bring this principle forward? Do we acknowledge it as intergenerational equity, or do we use intergenerational fairness as this term is mostly used throughout the European Union? So I would pose this question to our panelists and feel free to jump in. Who wants to take the first step?
Well, I can start. Well, for starters, I do think that it's important that we have like a proper terminology so that everyone knows what we're talking about. But I think the main issue is the concept, and we can call it fairness or equity or solidarity, and even in studying the principle, that's something that has been tricky because people call it different names. So if you go looking for intergenerational equity, you might not find it, but if you looked for solidarity, you'd find someone saying amazing things that could help you. So, what I think would be more beneficial is rather than increasing how we use intergenerational equity, would be in making this a more diffuse concept and making the notion of what the value of intergenerational equity is more known to policymakers, to people in general, to everyone really, and to know that this is the idea and that we can approach it through different lenses. I think that would be more helpful, and just to make the concept more diffuse and more accepted and more known than if we focused on having a proper terminology for it. But I do think that it could also be helpful to have a name for for it so everyone knows that we're talking about the same things. But mostly still I think the most important thing would be to make a more diffuse knowledge of it.
Thank you, Laura.
Agree on that, Laura. I think that we have an an internationally agreed principle, which is set on ground, which is intergenerational equity. And I'm actually glad that this session talks about intergenerational equity. This is the overarching principle. However, there might be different geographical areas that translated differently in terms of solidarity or fairness. It really depends, I think, also on the language. Sometimes, for example, I'm French, and when you say intergenerational solidarity in France, it means solidarity to the elders, actually. Which is something completely different than what we discussed today. So there are lots of terminologies depending on languages, concepts of time as well. This is something often overlooked, but depending on how you perceive time in the world, there are some communities that see the future as behind you and the past before you. So it would really depend also on your cultural setting. But there is this overarching principle that is intergenerational equity that also means legally binding solutions, which is something that is the strongest term that you could use. However, how it translates into policy will depend on your geographical, cultural, and political context.
All right. I guess I'm gonna echo what has been said. I just want to say that, I mean, there are so many terms that we try to use everywhere once they pop up in our language. If I'm making sense, like more use of the word of future generations, more use of meaningful use engagement, more use of intergenerational equity, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like if they fit in the document or speech or whatever we're saying, doing, then they fit, then we add them. It's just that maybe I want to, say that we have to always be careful about. It's not about using the term. It's about walking the talk. And like as Laura said, and yes, we can use the term, but we cannot just place the term everywhere without knowing how to actually practice that. So we don't want to be very invested in using it and forget about implementing that, but a balance between both. Use it and actually practice it, and we would be very good.
Thank you. Thank you so much for these perspectives and this kind of ground our further understanding of the term intergenerational equity, and also helps like adds another dimension to our survey and our next steps, because we are thinking about different workshops, especially on identifying different signals of change or like building different scenarios of the future. So we will definitely keep that in mind, and especially how different regions understand the term and how the term is translated into various languages. So, my sincere thank you to everyone for this amazing discussion. I have learned a lot, and I hope our participants have also enjoyed the conversation. With this, I will end our roundtable, and I have shared a link to our Youth Foresight project in the chat. Feel free to reach out because emails are listed at the bottom of the website, and we will be really keen on connecting with all young people who are working on the term or would like to engage further in our project. And my round of applause to our speakers. And hopefully, this wouldn't be our last conversation, and we'll have another sessions going forward. So, thank you, and I'll end the meeting now.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank
Bye,
you.
bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.